Shalom, everyone. We're going into the laws pertaining to the Sabbatical and Jubilee years. If you're hanging in there with me through this study, I commend you. As you can see, Bible study is more than just the traditional Sunday morning 30-minute session before church, going over a few New Testament scriptures about faith and blessings. It's so important to know the history in the Bible and understand it. The Israelites took the time and the effort to document these things so that we would never be lost, but have an understanding. This is our history and culture. Even for the commands we can no longer keep, we should know what they are about and have some idea about them. So if you're not aware of the Sabbath and Jubilee years according to the Bible, just as there was a weekly Sabbath every 7 days, there was to be a Sabbath year observed every 7 years, called the Sabbath year. The Most High promised an abundance of crops in the 6th year, such that it would get them through the 7th year of rest. Leviticus 25, 2-4 says, "When ye enter the land I am going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Most High. For 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards, and gather their crops. But in the 7th year the land is to have a year of Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Most High. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards." And in verse 6, we see that although we could not plant the field in the 7th year, we could eat what grew from it. It reads, "Whatever the land yields during the Sabbath year will be food for you, for yourself, your male and female servants, and the hired worker and temporary resident who lives among you, as well as your livestock and the wild animals in your land. Whatever the land produces may be eaten." And in Exodus 23, verse 11, we see who else could eat from our crops: the poor. Going back to verse 10, it reads, "For 6 years you are to sow your fields and harvest the crops, but during the 7th year let the land lie unplowed and unused. Then the poor among your people may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what is left. Do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove." So in the 7th sabbatical year, slaves were set free, debt was canceled, and land was not cultivated. Now let's look at the Jubilee year, which was ordained every 50 years, according to Leviticus 25, verse 8-13. After 7 cycles of the 7th year Sabbath, which is 49 years, the following 50th year was the year of Jubilee. This meant that there were 2 consecutive Sabbath years, the 49th year Sabbath year and the 50th Jubilee year. Some believe the year of Jubilee was actually in the 49th year, but most believe it is indeed in the 50th year, and I agree, based on Leviticus 25:10, which says, "Consecrate the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all of its inhabitants. It shall be a Jubilee for you. Each of you is to return to your family property and to your own clan." So if there's any confusion in the calculation, this scripture is pretty plain and straightforward. That Jubilee is the 50th year. Jubilee began with the blowing of the shofar on the Day of Atonement in the year of Jubilee. And slaves were set free, debt was canceled, land was not cultivated, and also stolen items were returned to their owner or to the heir. And a supernatural harvest was expected. So imagine the kind of faith you would have to have in the 7th Sabbath year, an entire year of not cultivating the land. And then for the year of Jubilee every 50 years, when not only are they refraining from harvesting in the 49th year, but also the 50th. So the Sabbath and Jubilee years are about faith in sustainability. We really don't know for sure when the actual sabbatical years are today, but many try to speculate. Nonetheless, these years are no longer observed today, mainly because of Leviticus 25, verse 2, which reads, "When you enter the land I am going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Most High." So these observances were to be adhered to once they were in the land, only when the Israelites controlled all of the land and tribes, including the 10. Because it says in verse 10, "Proclaim liberty throughout the land," and each one is to return to his family, property, and to his own clan. We also see again in Leviticus 25, verse 4, "But in the 7th year the land is to have a year of Sabbath rest." So these Sabbath days were rest for the land. The land was to experience the rest. And Israel is scattered today with other inhabitants in that land. So these laws are no longer observed today. So we're going to go through a series of laws covering the sabbatical and jubilee years. They will have 3 asterisks by them because they can no longer be kept. Remember, 1 asterisk means the law needs to be deleted, and 2 asterisks means the law and the scripture reference do not match, and something needs to be changed to match them. Starting with law number 279, to rest the land during the 7th year by not doing any work which enhances growth. Based on Exodus 34:21, 6 days thou shalt work, but on the 7th day thou shalt rest. In earing time and in harvest thou shalt rest. You see, I have 2 asterisks by this one because, as you can see, the scriptural reference is wrong. Exodus 34:21 refers to our 7th day of rest, not the 7th year of rest. The actual scripture for the Sabbath year is found in Leviticus 25:4, which reads, "But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land." So the 2 asterisks means its scriptural reference needs to be changed, and the 3 asterisks means we can no longer keep this law. And this is the only law in this video where the scriptural reference doesn't match the law. So for that reason, I will not read all of the scriptures, but I will put them down for you guys to read on your own. Other laws based on the same scripture are law number 280, not to work the land during the 7th year, based on Leviticus 25:4. We're getting that positive command in 279 telling us what to do, to rest the land. And here we get the negative command telling us what not to do, not to work the land. Sounds like a repeat, but it's not. Law number 281, not to work with trees to produce fruit during that year, based on Leviticus 25:4. So it's specifying between the land and the trees. Law number 282, not to reap crops that grow wild that year in the normal manner, based on verse 5. Law 283, not to gather grapes which grow wild that year in the normal way, based on verse 5. So regardless of harvesting, some things just grow on their own. We're commanded not to gather them up, neither in the fields or crops or in the vineyards. Remember, they had fields for cropping, and then they had vineyards. So these 2 laws deal with both. Law number 284, to leave free all produce which grew in that year, based on Exodus 23:11. Law 285, to release all loans during the 7th year, based on Deuteronomy 15:2. And I'm going to read this one. It says, "And this is the manner of the release. Every creditor that lends to his neighbor shall release it. He shall not exact it of his neighbor or his brother, because it's called the Most High's release." So the command is that in the 7th year, all creditors shall forgive debt. Law number 286, not to pressure or claim from the borrower, based on Deuteronomy 15:2, an extension of 285. Not only are loans and debts forgiven in the 7th year, there's a command not to pressure the debtor for the debt. Law number 287, not to refrain from lending immediately before the release of the loans for fear of monetary loss, based on Deuteronomy 15:9, but more specifically in verse 10. And I'll read this scripture as well. It says, "Thou shalt surely give him, and thine heart shall not be grieved when thou givest unto him." So Judaism created all kinds of rabbinical interpretations to somehow work around this, not lending prior to the 7th year, so they wouldn't have to deal with the potential loss. But we're commanded not to hesitate to lend to others right before the Sabbath year in fear that we won't get it back. So the Sabbath year is about restoration and freedom, including freedom from debt. This law was not meant to create a burden on those in need who needed assistance. Now let's look at laws pertaining to the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee is the year at the end of 7 cycles of 7 years in the land of Israel. It deals with land, property, and property rights. In this year, slaves and prisoners were to be freed, forgiven, and the Most High's mercy would manifest. The 50th year is the year of Jubilee, after the end of the final Sabbath year, based on Leviticus 25, verse 8. Law number 288, the Sanhedrin must count 7 groups of 7 years, based on Leviticus 25:8. Law number 289, the Sanhedrin must sanctify the 50th year, based on verse 10. The commands here are to count the years to keep track not only of the 7th sabbatical year, but the year of Jubilee, which pretty much comes once in a lifetime. Since the 50th year only came once in a lifetime, the Sanhedrin was purposed to count and keep track. This was an assembly of Jews, one from each city in the land. They were the judges that represented the court system established in Moses' day. They were to adhere to any matters of the law. Law number 290, to blow the shofar on the 10th of Tishrei, to free the slaves, based on Leviticus 25, verse 9 through 10. Law number 291, not to work the soil during the 50th year, based on verse 11. 292, not to reap in the normal manner that which grows wild in the 50th year. Law number 293, not to pick grapes which grew wild in the normal manner in the 50th year. Again, we're seeing provisions for the field and the vineyard. Law number 294, carry out laws of sold family properties, based on Leviticus 25:24. And I'll read this scripture. It says, "And in all the land of your possession, ye shall grant a redemption for the land." Law number 295, not to sell the land in Israel indefinitely. It reads, "The land shall not be sold forever, for the land is mine, for ye are strangers and sojourners with me." Leviticus 25:23. Law number 296, carry out the laws of houses in walled cities. Leviticus 25:29, it reads, "And if a man sell a dwelling house in a walled city, then he may redeem it within a whole year after it is sold. Within a full year may he redeem it." These three laws pertain to how to sell family property in Israel. But because the true Jews are scattered, it is no longer a law that can be kept today outside of the land. So regarding the Levites, remember they had no inheritance. So looking at Deuteronomy 18 verse 1, it says, "The priests, the Levites, and all the tribe of Levi shall have no part nor inheritance with Israel." Two laws derive from this scripture. Law number 297, the tribe of Levi must not be given a portion of the land in Israel. Rather, they are given cities to dwell in. Deuteronomy 18:1. And law number 298, the Levites must not take a share in the spoils of war, based on the same scripture. These two laws pertain to the Levites' lack of inheritance. They were not to be given land. Law number 299, to give the Levites cities to inhabit and their surrounding fields, based on Numbers 35:2. Law number 300, not to sell the field, but they shall remain the Levites before and after the Jubilee year, based on Leviticus 25:34. So provisions were made for the Levites for the Jubilee year to ensure they had continual possession of their land. We've officially made it to Law 300. So far, we've seen 15 laws that need to be omitted, 28 laws that need to be changed, and 74 laws that can no longer be kept today. So although we've reviewed 300 laws, there are only 285 true laws within them. You can follow along on my blog site, riseofthechosen.blogspot.com. And if you haven't downloaded a copy of the so-called 613 laws, you can find one at shabbat.org or aish.com. Thank you for watching. Until next time, this is Judiah. Shalom.